In this lecture, I'll be talking to you a little bit about understanding genre and how we define genres, how we define rhetoric and the rhetorical appeals, and finally, a little bit about narrative. Kenneth Burke is a rhetorician that once described academic conversations as being at a party, okay? And he wrote this in the 1940s, so he uses a parlor room as an example. And a parlor room, since you're not likely from the 1940s, is a room that's in the front of the house that usually when people were visiting each other, they would hang out and have a party. So this is his metaphor for academic conversations. And you can read the metaphor on your own, but I'm going to explain it to you because I think it's really important as a way for you guys to understand what we are trying to accomplish when we're creating academic conversations, academic writing in college. So, what Burke says is imagine you come to a party and you come late. And when you get there, you find that two of your friends are having a heated discussion, okay? They don't really pause because it's pretty heated. They just kind of keep on going, and you just listen, okay? You listen for a while, and then suddenly you kind of catch the tenor of the argument. You are like, okay, I see what person A is saying, I see what person B is saying. So once you do that, you put your oar in. You put yourself into the conversation. Someone answers you, you answer him or her. Another comes to your defense. Another aligns against you. And depending on how well the person aligns against you is whether your allies embarrassed or not. So this discussion never ends. Your friends keep arguing about this point until you just get sick of the argument and you leave. When you leave, however, the discussion still continues on. And the reason this metaphor is an interesting way to think of academic culture in college and in your composition or humanities courses is because when you are doing writing, you are participating in a conversation that's been happening for thousands of years. And as a new writer on the college level, you have to find out what the tenor of the conversation is, what the conversations have been about composition, about life, about all sorts of things that you'll research, not just in your English classes, before you can jump in. And that's usually that preliminary research you do, or reading an assignment sheet, um, heck, looking at a Wikipedia article, before you jump in and give your idea. And sometimes you're going to have really strong evidence and you're going to have others that support you. And sometimes you're going to have ideas that others disagree with. And they might disagree with compelling evidence that makes you change your mind. But when you leave college, these conversations in the classes that you take will still be happening. But you will grow from having participated in those conversations as a thinker, writer, reader, and learner. And that's what one of my goals for you this semester is to teach you how to be a better thinker, learner, writer, and reader. So the subject of what we're going to be exploring in this course has to do with genre. And you've probably heard this word before, genre. A lot of people usually associate it with something like music, rock, pop, country. Those are different genres of music. Or they might associate it with fiction, nonfiction, um, fiction, like a chick lit book or a horror movie, a horror book, or like a vampire book. It's just genre just means that we're sorting things into categories. And when we're talking about writing, writing has changed so much in the last 20 years because there are so many different genres or categories for us to choose from in our writing. Used to it was ink on paper. Now we're creating communication through social media, through text message, through emails, through essays in our college courses. And those genres each have their place in writing, eh, but that can also complicate how you learn to write, because you have to learn how to switch your understanding of the genre in order to be able to write for that particular audience or purpose. And that's going to be a big topic of what we explore this semester. Another example of genres could be something like restaurants. You have fast food, you have Italian, you have like American, you have Asian. So it's just putting things into categories. And when we're talking about writing, you need to know that there are different categories of writing beyond the 5 paragraph essay that or the research term paper that you might had to have written in previous courses that you've taken to learn to be a writer. Now, that doesn't mean that those are not valuable tools to know and won't be helpful to you as you continue your education, because if you plan to go further in your education, you are going to need to write traditional essays and research papers, because those are a part of the academic community. But your instructors in college and your bosses in the workforce are going to expect that you also know how to write in some of the new genres. And that's why in this course we will be writing a traditional essay and do traditional research, but we're going to learn how to re-see our writing in new genres to help give you the foundation and prepare you for the types of critical thinking about writing in different genres you're going to need to be able to do as you progress in your education. And that's even if this is the last class you ever take, you decide not to pursue any more higher education, and you go into the workforce, you're still going to have to learn to write in different genres. And as we'll see, as the course progresses, genres genres of writing affect our everyday life, especially now. People often say, people today, they don't read and write. Well, I mean, I don't know about you, but I know plenty of people who sleep with their phone and they are constantly reading it and writing in it and moving things around. And that might not be academic writing, but it doesn't make it any less valuable, because learning the skills for communication is going to help you in your personal life as well as your academic life. So that's what a genre is, and that's kind of my little soapbox about why genres are important. But what you need to know about genres are 2 really important things, okay? First, genres change according to the way people use them. For example, if you send a text message to your friend telling them why you're running late, that message might look a lot different than if you send a text message to your boss telling them why you're running late. Text message to a friend might be like, sorry, be there in 5. Text message to a boss, of course this does depend on the relationship, might be like, I'm terribly sorry, my car broke down, I am running 5 minutes late. You might give more information, you might pay more attention to your grammar depending on your job. So even though it's the same genre, sending a text message, because the audience and the purpose changed, the genre kind of changes the way that you use it. The second thing that you need to know about genres is that they are also flexible. So sometimes there might be a combination of things within a genre. For example, if I ask you to write a 5 paragraph essay, I might just ask you to write it timed in class without any sources, and that's a 5 paragraph essay. But then if I ask you to write a 5 paragraph essay with research, you have to be able to write in 2 different genres because you have to be able to include your research into the genre of the traditional essay. The same goes for if I ask you to take a traditional essay and turn it into a new genre. You might have to take a combination of the information in that essay and think about it in a new way. So, just to think about it for a second, what do you already know about genres? Think to yourself about what you already know about genres. You probably already know that genres are categories, and you might associate them with something like music. But one example of what you might already know about genre is when 2 musicians from different genres are flexible and they combine. Okay? And then you get something like a song that's got a mix of country and rap mixed together. And now they've remixed the genre. Okay? So, very important, understanding what a genre is. This is something we will come back to and think about in this course. Another thing that you need to consider when you're thinking about understanding and composing in different genres is the rhetorical situation. First, I want to define for you rhetoric. Sometimes when people hear the word rhetoric, the first association they usually have is rhetorical question. And when I ask them, what is a rhetorical question? They say, well, it's a question you already know the answer to. And I ask them, why do you use it? And they say, to be sarcastic. And they don't really have an idea about it. And that's not really a definition of rhetoric, but it is an example of rhetoric. A rhetorical question is a tool that a writer uses for effect, to make a point, by asking a question that there is no need to answer because the audience or person they're speaking to realizes that the question is redundant. The question is redundant, but it's to have them pause and think. The second thing people usually associate with rhetoric is politics. They usually will say, well, I hear them whenever they talk about the president or the governor, they say, their rhetoric was really fiery. And that actually is also not a definition of rhetoric. In some ways, it's a misuse of the word rhetoric because they're equating the definition of rhetoric with like BS, which is not what rhetoric is. Okay. Rhetoric is actually the ability to discern the tools of persuasion used to create an argument. So, what that means, in the simplest of terms, is that rhetoric is the ability for you as a reader or listener or viewer to understand how the author is using certain tools to persuade you about a purpose to create an argument. That's what rhetoric is, okay? It's the ability of you as the reader or the writer, or as the reader or the viewer or the listener, to understand the tools that the author is using to persuade you about their argument, okay? In order to understand rhetoric and the rhetorical situation, it is important that you understand what context is, okay? Just a dirty definition from Google. Context is the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea in terms of which it can be fully understood and assessed. And the reason that context is at the center of all of this is because you can't really understand what's going on in an argument unless you understand the factors that surround it. Okay? Have you ever seen the show Family Guy? That show is not funny if you have no concept of 80s, 90s, and early 2000s popular culture. They use inside jokes, context, that if you don't understand what certain things are, you just don't find funny. So, context is the key to understanding Family Guy. Context is also the key to understanding in all sorts of different kinds of arguments that you might run into in your everyday life. For example, if you hear a soundbite from your favorite musician on a gossip blog and it says something that you know is contrary to the person's personality, and then you go and watch and you just hear that soundbite, but then you go and you watch the whole thing and realize that the soundbite was taken and turned into something else, missing this huge context that surrounds it, and you're like, well, it's not fair people are being so mean to so-and-so. If you listen to the context, that's not what they meant at all. So context is really key to being able to understand arguments, okay? And we'll talk more about context and rhetoric again. So anytime during this lecture, if you're feeling like, okay, this is a lot of information, I'm trying to get these terms down, don't worry. We'll be practicing with them, and I'll be reiterating these definitions throughout the semester, okay? So we know what rhetoric is, we understand what context is, and so another way of seeing rhetoric is understanding the rhetorical situation. And you're going to see that I ask you to consider the rhetorical situation a ton this semester. So I'm circling this right here. Commit to memory this definition, okay? The rhetorical situation is the relationship between the audience, the text, and the author. Memorize this. This will show up on the midterm, okay? The rhetorical situation is the relationship between the author, the text, and the audience, okay? One way to see this is by looking at what we call the rhetorical triangle, okay? This is a way to like understand the rhetorical situation. I don't know why that little thing just, there we go, that's better. Okay, so when we look at the rhetorical situation and we're considering that relationship, the rhetorical triangle helps us to understand it because you can see that all of these things have to intersect to create a argument, okay? The author has to consider the audience and has to, before it can write the text, okay? The audience has to consider the author before it reads the text. The text is created with audience in mind and the author in mind because the author creates it. The glue that binds all three of these things is the context, okay? Without context, these three things can't work together, okay? So when I ask you about the rhetorical situation, I'm asking you to think of this rhetorical triangle. Think about the relationship between the author, the audience, and the text, okay? So two other super important parts of understanding creating compositions in college and beyond is being able to understand audience and purpose, okay? So when you're thinking of purpose, you have to think of why you're composing something. What is your purpose? What do you want to get across to your audience? What's your reason for creating it? And then you have to think about that rhetorical situation. What's your relationship with the text? What's your relationship with the author? What context surrounds that purpose? And then finally, you have to have a plan and you have to have a genre choice. And your audience is going to affect your plan and your genre choice, okay? Your audience is who you're composing for. And things to think about are, how do you know who it's for? So be specific when you're considering your audience. For example, when I ask you who your audience is, if you say general audience, That means absolutely nothing, okay? You have to be specific about your audience. An audience of American community college students. That's a specific audience. A general audience means nothing. So if you write that on any of your assignments, if I ask you to define your audience and you say general audience, I will mark that incorrect, okay? Because there has to be a specific audience that you are composing for. And in your major assignments, I'm going to try to give you a very specific audience so that you know how to create your purpose, okay? So here's an example of how to think about it. Say you are given the task to write a sex education manual, okay? And this sex education manual is going to be for third graders, all right? So that is going to really change your plan, your purpose, and your rhetorical situation. First, you have to think of your audience. Who's your audience? Third graders. And if they're third graders, who else is also implied as the audience? Their parents, okay? So you know your audience is third graders, parents, teachers, school board, all the people involved in that third grader's life, okay? So then you have to think about the third grader themselves. If your purpose is to teach sex education to a third grader, you have to think about what is appropriate for a third grader, okay? So that might mean that when you plan your composition, you know, when you consider the author, yourself, the text, sex education manual, and a third grader, then when you consider that situation, then that changes how you plan something, okay? So, and that'll even change your genre choice. So even though it's a book, you know that when you're making plans for composing this, if it's for a third grader, what kind of topics are you going to talk about? You're probably not going to go into a lot of details. What third graders probably need to know is going to be like stranger danger, good touch, bad touch, right? What are your images going to look like? They're not going to be graphic. They're probably going to be smiley faces and frowny faces, correct? The words that are in there are probably going to be really short, small words, the language that it's composed in, because you're considering your audience, okay? Now, you also have to consider that context, right? Let's look back at this. You also have to consider in this example your context, because you know that if you're giving this to a third grader, it's not just the third grader that's reading it, it's the parents. And so you have to think what all the parents in the school district are going to be think are appropriate to tell third graders, okay? Now, what if we change your audience and you have to create a sex ed education book for seniors in high school, okay? Now that's probably going to change how you compose it, because you still have the context of they're still minors, so you still have to consider the parents in the school and what the school rules are, the school board's rules. But even though they're still students and they still have those attached, they're older. And so your choices of what your plan and your genre choice is going to be different. For instance, you might not only make a traditional book, but you also might make it available online in an ebook, okay? And you also might make links to it shareable on social media so that teenagers could share it. They probably wouldn't, but hey, this is a fake example, right? So that's also going to change what you put in it, right? Seniors in high school need to know how it works, right? They don't have to have graphic images. They're probably going to have images that are kind of scientific in nature, with this is how a woman's anatomy works, this is how the male anatomy works. It's probably going to have horror stories about teen pregnancy and all these things. And depending on what state you live in, it'll talk about contraception or not. And it could be abstinence. That's going to depend on the context. In the state of South Carolina, the context for how you're going to make that manual would be different if you lived than if you were writing for one in California. So all of those things have to go into the mix when you're thinking about creating in a genre. And so that's how you understand audience and purpose. And that's when you have to be specific. So let's say, and this is the final part of this example, that you did such a wonderful job on these other two that the publishers decided that they want you to write a manual for nursing students. Well, now your audience is completely shifted. They're nursing students, so presumably they're adults. They're in college. That's the context, right? What are they going to need to know? The words in there are probably not going to be conversational. They're going to be educational. So there's probably going to be medical terms for the proper parts of the anatomy. There's probably going to be pictures of diseases, things to look for, those sorts of things. So your plan and your genre choice changes when you're thinking about that. So always, always, when you're creating a composition in any class and in life, think about your audience and purpose. It will make you stronger at creating arguments. Sorry, guys, I have a cold. All right. So I told you before that rhetoric is the ability to discern the tools of persuasion used to convince you of a purpose. And there are 3 tools that we're going to talk about in this lecture that authors use to use in their text to convince their audience of their purpose. The first appeal is ethos, and that's your credibility or authority or trustworthiness. The second appeal is pathos, and that appeals to emotion and or value. And the third appeal is logos or logos, and that's the logic of the facts and evidence. So these 3 tools, ethos, pathos, and logos, are what authors use when they're creating a composition to convince their audience of a certain purpose. Let's look at the first one, ethos. We persuade an audience by using rhetorical appeals. Rhetorical appeals, particular elements in a piece of persuasion that work together to convince an audience of an overall purpose. This is just exactly what I repeated before. I forgot I had this slide in there. There are different ways of using the different ways of using the appeals is going to depend on the rhetorical situation. So it's going to depend on that relationship of the author with the audience with the text, and that context that surrounds it, and those genre choices that you're making for that particular audience. So let's look at ethos. So ethos is credibility or authority, okay? And so when you look at your textbook, how do you know that your textbook is authoritative? Like, how do you know that what is in your textbook is right? Well, usually because an instructor who's studied how to teach you has chosen it for you, or a department. The other thing is you can look at the author, look at their About Me, and see who they are. I'm flipping right now in the Bedford Book of Genres to the author's About Me. Hold on, let me find it. And we can see that Amy Brazaler is from Red Rocks Community College, and Elizabeth Kleinfeld is from Metropolitan State College of Denver. And if we look at their biography, we'll learn they have lists of who, they have different lists of who they are, what all they have accomplished, the different publications they've made, what their degrees are in. And so they're establishing in the textbook that they are an authority on composition, okay? Think about a commercial. Commercial is another way to understand ethos. An example might be Justin Bieber in a Proactive pimple cream commercial, okay? You have to consider the audience. Now, you might not be influenced by Justin Bieber. I am certainly not, but if you are, hey, that's good for you. But if that commercial is trying to sell pimple cream, why would they pick someone like Justin Bieber to be a spokesperson? Because they're considering their audience, who likely has pimples, that idolizes Justin Bieber, 13-year-old girls, okay? So while Justin Bieber might not be an authority to you in a pimple cream commercial, he might be an authority to a 13-year-old girl. And if it's good enough for Justin Bieber, by goodness, that is enough authority for her. She is going out and purchasing said pimple cream. Okay? In a story, authors can establish authority by explaining who the main character is, and that influences your reliability. And sometimes when you are looking for ethos in a story, you might think that the narrator is not very reliable, and that can affect whether you trust them in the story. Or there might be characters in the story, like a doctor, that represents authority, that that helps you to believe that if the doctor says to the main character, you have cancer, then that the person actually has cancer. Why do you believe that in the story? Because the doctor said it, and they are an authority on health. Okay? So those are some examples of ethos. And I know that these rhetorical appeals can get a little tricky with keeping them together, but don't worry, we're going to practice a lot on these this semester. So just push through. The next appeal is pathos. And this one's kind of my favorite one because I think it's easiest to pick out. Now, that also depends on who you are as an audience, whether it's easiest for you to pick out, but to me it is. Pathos is an author's appeal to emotion, okay? And that can be by using humor, by using sadness, by using patriotism, by using anger. There is a reason why beer and soda cans are red, white, and blue, okay? There is a reason because they are telling their audience, rather it's subconscious, that they are the choice of America's soft drink or beer. Okay? Again, the emotion can be outright, but it also depends on the audience. It might be something funny. I mean, there is $1 million, bazillion dollar industry on Super Bowl commercials that are funny. And the reason is because when people laugh, they say, "Oh, did you see that commercial? It was so funny. They were herding cats." And they tell somebody about it the next day, and they talk about the product. And that is why the authors of those commercials choose the pathos, the tool of pathos, to convince their audience to buy their product or talk about their product by using humor. So humor can be a part of emotion. Again, this is all going to depend on the audience. Another example is something like the ASPCA commercial. If you've ever seen it, with the poor little one-eyed cat, meow, and the dog in the cage that's been beat and abandoned. And then they play that really sad music by Sarah McLachlan, and you're like, "Take all my monies, little animals. Here's my wallet." And you're ready to give them all your money because you feel so sorry for the dogs or the cats. They're using that emotion to get you to give them money. And it works. It works on me. I hate it when little animals are in danger. And so all of these things are used by authors when composing things to appeal to their audience. And it can be not just in commercials. I mean, it can be in written text too. In a story, you might have the main character's mother die. And that's supposed to make you feel for the character, to convince you about that character's personality. Or in a research paper, you might use a little bit of humor to grab your audience's attention. Or if you're making an argumentative paper, you might invoke patriotism to get people to see your point of view. So these are some examples of how the a rhetorical appeal of pathos, or the appeal to emotion, works. The final rhetorical appeal that we're going to talk about today, there are more, but these are the three we're going to focus on, is logos. And that's the logic and connections of facts and evidence. And where I think pathos is the best appeal, and I love it, my husband, he falls into this category. He's like, he sees the sad cat commercial, and it's not like he doesn't like sad cats or want to help sad cats, but he's like, all he can think about is, I want to know how much money actually goes to the cat. I need to know the facts. I need to know the evidence before I get my wallet out. Where I'm like, please, let's give them all our money. He's like, I need to know the facts, ma'am. So Examples of logos are those facts, statistics, charts, graphs, before and afters, reasoned arguments. Again, this depends on your audience. So if you have a commercial for a car, one thing you might notice is at the end of the commercial, they tell you how many miles per gallon it gets, how many how many horsepower it has, what type of engine it has, what cool new features it has. Those facts about the car help sell the car. A beautiful girl on the hood can only do so much. In a research paper, you might give a chart of statistics to prove your point. Online, you might read an infographic that tells you all this information, that's giving you the facts about a topic to help you learn about it. It can also be before and after. If you use this paper towel versus the leading brand, poor leading brand always sucks. This paper towel main brand paper towel is the strongest. Leading brand is horrible. Here's our before and after. That's an example of an author using logic, okay? And it doesn't just have to be facts, stats, charts, graphs, and before and afters. It can also be a reasoned argument. For example, if you're writing an essay and you say, because of A, you must believe B, you're making a reasoned argument, okay? You're using that as part of your evidence. And we'll talk a little bit more about reasoned arguments in the second unit because they can be a little trickier than just understanding facts and graphs and before and afters. But hold on to your hats for that one. So these are the rhetorical appeals: ethos, pathos, and logos. And these are three tools that an author uses when they are considering their audience to create a text, to convince that audience of a specific purpose. So the rhetorical appeals are used in order to convince an audience of a specific purpose, and they are used by an author of that piece, no matter what the genre is. Just a side note. These are the uses of the appeals, but they can sometimes be misused for a variety of nefarious and noble reasons. That is called a fallacy. More on that later. I hope that this lecture has helped you to understand more about genre, rhetoric, and I hope that you will find it helpful in your study and composition this semester.